Making connections, affecting the culture, just doing life. It's Engage Magazine on American Family Radio.
Wesley, we are not afraid to talk about our failures as parents, especially since our kids are really too young to remember our failures. Hopefully they won't scar them forever.
Not afraid, but embarrassed.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. What we recognize is that every parent has failed at one point in time. They've made the mistakes, and we have lived to tell the tale. And we're going to share some of those horror stories today, especially because we do have Jordan Chambly, Engage Project Director, who is already a dad, but yet to be parent. I always feel weird on this discussion because you are a dad.
In other words, yes, we're still expecting the baby.
Right. But really, you are a dad. It's just the baby's not here yet.
Right.
So, yeah, there's something there. So your baby is due?
In March.
In March,
yeah.
So, yeah.
And how long have you been married? Back up a little bit here, because he's new to all this.
Yeah, I was married last December.
Okay.
Yeah.
And got a baby due in March.
Mm-hmm.
So you got it in the right order.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. That's a good thing.
It is. So let me ask you this, Jordan. Just because your baby is coming, you've already done all the announcements. You've made it Facebook official, so it's a real thing now.
It's real now.
So what are some of the most interesting advice you have received from people?
Well, not so much advice as just like looks. You know what I mean? Like I tell people, "Oh, I'm expecting a baby," and they just kind of look at me like, "Well,
because
you better."
You're not expecting the baby.
Well, yeah, that. But they just kind of look at me like, "Oh, you better get ready for." The worst thing ever to happen to you.
Yeah, but
and it's all a joke. Obviously, it's all a joke. They don't really think that, but they're messing with me a little bit. So I haven't really gotten advice. It's more like just sort of jabs. Yeah, please.
Well, that's why we
please.
Invited you into the program today, because we have much advice.
Yeah, because I don't want to be the worst dad.
And some encouragement, because we'll get to the advice later. We'll start with we'll do the positive first, and then the quote unquote negative later. The positive is, on all seriousness, they bring a whole different dimension and just complete joy to your life, and especially understanding that children are a blessing. I think obviously a lot of the culture looks at it as a hassle, when the reality is it's a blessing.
Right.
They're very literally a piece of you and a piece of your wife, and whether it's in the way they end up acting or whether it's in the way they look, they really do bring that dimension. And they allow you to step back and realize that things are not moving as fast as you think they are.
Oh, okay.
And you can look at that and really just provide that extra piece where you thought that you just had to get to that football game, or you just had to get to that church that night. But when the baby has that dirty diaper, right when you're walking out the door, things slow down just a little bit.
Or spit up on you.
Or spit up on you.
It forces you to slow down then, okay.
Yeah. It really does.
That.
And it's so interesting because it also reveals to you this is what the priority actually is. And like you said, the football game is not the priority, but the feeding the baby is. And you realize my life can continue without watching this football game.
Yeah.
And so, now, Jordan, I know you're not a big football fan.
I'm not a big sports fan in general.
That's not a big thing to you, but,
But I have other things that I want to do,
Exactly, yeah. So, now, I will say this. One of the best discussions that I ever had around seasoned parents was, I said, I know there's a lot of advice you could give me, but what I really want to hear are what are some of the best resources that you found in your parenting, right? So, because if I speak, I speak from personal experience. I don't speak from study and statistics and, deep knowledge of Scripture and all these different things.
Right.
All I can tell you is where I messed up.
Yeah.
And so that was one of the most helpful things to me, was going to people and saying, what did you do that you feel, what work did you do that that made you feel like you became a better parent? And so, Wesley, what's one of your favorite resources or books that helped you in being a dad?
Great question. My parents.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Yeah. That is a really good point.
Babysitters.
Babysitters, yeah. Well, I actually have not, my son's 1 year old, I have not read just an incredible amount of books. Let me reset us here. You're listening to Engage Magazine on American Family Radio. We have a handful of articles that regarding with parents, parenting, children, being a father, fatherhood, adulthood, and you can find those articles on engagemagazine.net under Connections, engagemagazine.net. Under the tab Connections, we have a lot of articles just for you there, for you new parents, or those that are like Jordan here that are about to be parents, or those that are in college that are considering being a parent at some point. So you can go there, find those there. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And we're so grateful that you've tuned in this afternoon to listen to this program on American Family Radio. You were asking me the questions about what now?
About what's one of the best books or resources you've had for being a dad.
So I haven't not read just an incredible amount. I've read a lot about being a husband.
Right.
But at this point, being a 1-year-old.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to be honest with you here, and this is okay, but at this point, I help out so much around the house. I do the diaper, feed, all that kind of stuff. But my primary role at this point, I don't feel like it's there yet. I feel like Chelsea, my wife, is teaching him the A's, the ABC, the colors and the numbers and all that. And I try to read some books to him the best. Yeah. But I feel like that's where my wife's at right now. Yeah. I feel like my role is going to develop into his character and to being a young man and the yes ma'am, no ma'ams like that. Now I know we'll do a combination of that. And there's a combination. You always have a little bit, whether it's 10 or 15% or 20%. But I feel like the primary role of at this point, at 1 year old, is my wife, because she's the one that carried him in his womb. She's the one that, nursed him. She's the one that made sure he got to the doctor's appointment, and that's kind of her thing. Now I'm there, I'm present, but I don't feel like I get to maximize the gifts that God's given me yet.
Now I'll tell you this: I've got a 4-year-old. Jeremy could speak to this. Our producer could speak a lot more to this. His oldest is 13, right, Jeremy?
That's correct.
So his oldest is 13, so he's actually got more of this than I do. My oldest is 4, and that role has certainly grown from. Now, like you, I've got a son that is 10 months old, so I'm kind of in that both area, right? So, but I got to say this, one of the best resources that I've ever read, there's 2, and one I'm going to kind of wait till the next segment because we're going to talk a lot about it, but one of them is by Vodi Bakum, and it's called Family Shepherd. Absolutely convicting, absolutely just wonderful book. I highly encourage it to any parent to be, especially the dads. Another really great resource by Robert Lewis called Raising a Modern Day Knight. If you're having a son, read that book. So good. But one of the latest ones that are actually the last one I read is by Paul David Tripp, and it is called Parenting, 14 Gospel Principles That Can Radically Change Your Family. So good. And the cool news is we have this guy. Yes. We've got Paul David Tripp coming on the next segment. And Jordan, I want to ask you before we, because we're about to have to close out, what is one question you'd like us to ask Paul David Tripp when we have him on air?
That's easy. How to best serve my wife, because she's a nurse. She's already very busy. So when the baby comes, I'm going to have to be on my toes.
Yep.
Well, you're exactly right. And that's a great question because that really is the only thing you can do.
Right.
So knowing that how to do it is good because that's all you can do at the point. And in those first 3 or 4 or 5 weeks out of that, when she's back from the hospital, she's the most vulnerable. She's the most, most dependent on you.
Right.
And the baby's dependent on her.
Yeah.
And so there's just a lot going on there. And as we'll talk about in the next segment, the word grace is very appropriate.
Absolutely.
In fact, I've written an article on this. It's on engagemagazine.net. As soon as we got home from the hospital, my wife said, she told me, you're going to have to extend me some grace over these next couple of weeks. And there's a good article on that.
And it really is. And the thing is, you're going to have to extend grace to one another because you're going to be tired. You're going to be frustrated. Those things are going to happen. But here's the thing. Don't let any statement like that bring fear into your life. And if you listeners out there who may be, about to have a kid or you're looking forward to parenting, don't let any news discourage you. Parenting is one of the greatest things you will ever have in your life. It's also one of the most sanctifying things, and we're going to talk about that in the next segment with Dr. Paul David Tripp. Again, he's the author of Parenting, 14 Gospel Principles That Can Radically Change Your Family, so stay tuned. And if you missed any of this, you can always check us out at engagemagazine.net/podcast.
We're back. It's Engage Magazine on American Family Radio.
Wesley, in the last segment, we did discuss about how our questions that we as parents had, especially when we first started this whole journey of having kids and realizing the weight of the responsibility of teaching the gospel and living the gospel out in front of these little tiny human beings who are filled with questions, filled with wonder, and how much, we really do carry that weight every day, every minute. We had Jordan in, and he gave us some great questions for our guest in this segment, who is Dr. Paul David Tripp. Paul David Tripp is the president of Paul Tripp Ministries, the executive director of the Center for Pastoral Life and Care. He's written over 17 books, 14 teaching series, and he also travels the world speaking on parenting and marriage and how those two relate in the gospel. He's got an MDiv from the Reformed Episcopal Seminary and a DMin from biblical counseling from Westminster Theological Seminary.
So he's going to have a little bit more of an authority on this topic than you and I will.
Exactly why we wanted to have him in.
That's what you were talking about.
So, Dr. Tripp, first off, thank you for being here. We appreciate your time so much.
Well, it's great to be with you.
So your latest book is Parenting, 14 Gospel Principles That Can Radically Change Your Life. I've got to ask you, now my oldest is 4 years old. I've got 3 kids. And when we found out that we were going to have a kid, I gobbled up every book that I could find, and I realized there were a lot more books than just the ones that I found. There's a ton of parenting books out there. So what drove you to write this one? You also have several books. What drove you to write this specific one?
Well, I think that as I've had conversations with parents after parents and looking at a variety of parenting books that are out there, I came to the conclusion that there was something very significant missing from the way we as believers think about parenting. And what was missing was the gospel of Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. Now, here's what I mean by that. That we set up a system of parenting that is basically asking the law to do what only grace can accomplish. And so we think that if we have the right set of rules and regulations and we properly control the behavior of our children will be okay. The fact of the matter is that there's no parent that has any power whatsoever to change their child. I can't change anybody. If a parent could change a child, Jesus would have never had to come. And so the parenting is really involving myself in something that I can't do, but that the one that I'm representing can do very well.
In your first chapter, you start off with some good and not so good parent ideas when it comes to your children, and you address particular issues. Where did you come up with these stories? TJ and I are parents ourselves. My son just turned 1. You've got 3 kids. What ages?
I've got 4, 2, and 10 months.
Okay, so we've already got a handful of stories, but where did you come up with these stories?
Well, out of my own life, most of the stories, because I've made every mistake a parent could ever make, and then from conversations with I think literally thousands of parents over the years, and I just think that it's so easy in the press of parenting to forget who you are and forget what you've been given. First is, I don't own my children. They don't belong to me. They're not my possessions to do with what I want to do and to get from them what I want. My children belong to God. That means my position is God's representative. That God makes his invisible authority and his invisible grace visible in the lives of children by sending parents as representatives of his authority and his grace. And so everything I do, I must do as God's representative.
Oh, Dr. Tripp, that is so good, and we appreciate that so much. Now, what you've just said, I know for me as with just a heart of a dad, that's heavy. So the invisible authority, the invisible grace of God is made visible in me and my wife in how we parent our children. And I know I've spoken with several parents who, when they come to the realization of the responsibility, especially laid out for them in Deuteronomy, in chapter 6, where God lays down the law and says, you're responsible, you teach your children, day in and day out, when you're laying down, when you're rising up, and they feel that responsibility and they're almost overwhelmed by it. How do you respond to when we do get so busy in the press of parenting that we just get overwhelmed and think there's no way that I can adequately represent the gospel to my children?
See, if you're gonna represent God's grace in your children, to your children, and remember, grace never calls wrong right. If wrong were right, there'd be no need for grace. Grace is a way of dealing with wrong. If you're going to represent God's grace in your children, you have to seek His grace for you. And here's what this means. You have to run to the truth that God will never call us to a task without enabling us to do it. If He puts a Red Sea in front of us and He means for us to cross it, He's going to build a bridge, He's going to send a boat, He's going to give us the ability to swim, or He's going to part the waters. There's something even more. The Bible teaches that God never sends us without going with us. And so what I have to do is I have to feed my heart on the grace of God so that I parent with hope, I parent with courage, I parent with patience. Because what gets in the way of good parenting is my heart. I'm impatient. I want life to be easy. I want my kids to be self-parenting. And so to the degree that you're not dealing with your own heart issues, you won't get at heart issues with your kids.
You're listening to Engage Magazine on American Family Radio. Thank you so much for listening this afternoon. TJ and I, TJ's the host and I'm the co-host, and we got Dr. Paul David Tripp on discussing parenting. If you missed the first 8 minutes of the program, you can go to engagemagazine.net and you can click on the podcast there. We'll have it loaded up there. Also, you can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. We'll keep you posted on the most recent things such as a conference coming up and other events with our YouTube videos that we're posting. And this right here is being YouTube. We're videoing this, so we'll have this up on our YouTube channel soon. Thank you so much for listening. Dr. Paul, I do have a question for you. We talked right when we came out of the shoot, you talked about the rules and how rules are good for some things, but without grace, they don't mean much. What would you say, and how would you respond to the parent who would say, well, if that's the case, we're just going to let our kids do whatever they want and let them figure it out on their own?
Well, here's what you need to understand. Parenting is about understanding law and understanding grace. There is a very, very important role of God's law in the life of your child. Two things. First of all, God's designed His law to expose sin. Your children need to come to the point where they understand that something is broken inside of them that causes them to do the things they do and to say the things they say, and that they can't fix it. So the law exposes that brokenness. Second, the law is God's gift to us because it's a guide for life. It's God telling us how He's designed for us to live. So it's not true that grace means you just abandon the law. In fact, think about when the law was first given. The law was given to the children of Israel after God had redeemed them from slavery. The law was a grace. God is gracing His people with His law. What I have to understand, though, is the limits of the law. The law exposes sin. It's a wonderful guide for life. But it has no power whatsoever to transform your children. And so that's where God's grace comes in. It's only God's grace that has the power to rescue, forgive, transform, and deliver our children so that they can be what they're supposed to be and do what God has designed for them to do.
And all of this that we're talking about in this segment is all found, again, in Dr. Paul David Tripp's new book, Parenting, 14 14 Gospel Principles that can radically change your family. And Dr. Paul, tell us really quick, where can we pick up the book?
Well, it's available on Amazon, of course, but you can get it at my website. It's paultripp.com.
Okay.
And there's a store there with all kinds of resources, but the book is there.
You know, Dr. Tripp, one of the things that we have talked about on EngageMagazine.net is Wesley has actually written an article about the sanctification of marriage and how marriage pushes us to become more and more reflective of Christ, especially as husbands, as we serve our wives. But what you just said a few minutes ago is that parenting has a huge role in our sanctification as well. Can you discuss that a little more in depth?
Well, again, one of the things that marriage and family does is it exposes my heart. And the exposure of my heart is meant to create in me a sense of need, which God uses to drive me to himself in confession and in faith. I like to think of it this way. In all of those moments when I'm parenting my children, the wise Heavenly Father is parenting everybody in the room. Mm-hmm. And so I don't look at those moments as a hassle. Let me say it this way. If your eyes ever see or your ears ever hear the sin, weakness, and failure of your children, it's never an accident. It's never an interruption. It's never a hassle. It's always grace. God loves those children. He's put them in a family of faith, and he will reveal their need to you so you can be a tool of his rescue in the lives of those children, but also so that you would receive his rescue for yourself.
Oh, thank you so much. You know, we've got our project director, Jordan Chambly. He was on with us in the first segment, and we wanted to have him ask a question, and so this comes from him. Now, Jordan, his first child is due in March, and so, you know, he's preparing to be a dad. He's asking lots and lots of questions. He's getting some really good advice. He's getting some really terrible advice. But, you know, one of the questions
the terrible advice is coming from you, TJ, okay?
Most of it, yeah. So, but one of the questions that he has that's most pressing on his heart is, as a new dad, when the baby comes, how can I serve my wife? So could you speak to that really quick?
Well, I just think that you cannot overstate the massive responsibility of parenting. You have all the physical welfare of a child. That child comes from the hospital, totally dependent on you. But the way I like to think of the responsibility is, what could be more significant in all of life than to be God's representative on site, God's main tool for the forming of a human soul? And so you have to understand that your wife with you has taken on the most significant human responsibility that anybody can take on. And it's very, very hard. It's very, very time-consuming. It's exhausting. It's emotional. And so you want to be an agent of comfort and encouragement and help. And you want to look at her every day and remember the huge responsibility that she's bearing as a mother.
And again, you've been listening to Paul David Tripp on Engage. Dr. Tripp, really quickly, tell us a little bit about your ministry and about Paul David Tripp. Well, yeah, Paul David Tripp Ministries. In the last minute we have.
Our mission statement is to connect the transforming power of Jesus Christ to everyday life. We want people to understand the present, right here, right now benefits of the person and work and presence and promises of Jesus. You understand the gospel right here, right now. It will change the way you approach everything in your life.
Oh, that is so good. And again, tell us one more time, where can we find the book, the Parenting 14 Gospel Principles that can radically change your family?
PaulTripp.com.
All right. We've been talking with Dr. Paul David Tripp. He is a parenting expert that speaks all over the world, all over the country. Any of his books are absolutely wonderful. Dr. Tripp, let me ask this one last question. What other books that you have that you would recommend, especially to new parents?
Well, I mean, the one that I would recommend the most is my devotional, New Morning Mercies.
Oh, that is a great book.
I wrote 365 fresh gospel devotionals. You read that every morning. You remind yourself of the grace that's been given you so you can give grace to your children. Thank you again, Dr. Tripp. We appreciate your time. We appreciate you coming on to Engage Magazine. If you missed any of this program, you can find it at engagemagazine.net/podcast, where you can hear this again and again, or if you missed the first segment, get it there.